Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film The Oxbow Incident from 1943, and this continues my quest to review as much of William Wellman's filmography as I possibly can. Now, The Oxbow Incident is probably the most pessimistic film I can think of that William Wellman has directed. This film is based on the novel of the same name, written by Walter Van Tilburg Clark, who Wellman would later make a film of another book of his, The Track of the Cat, which I'll review later. The Oxbow Incident, Henry Fonda and his friend, played by Harry Morgan, come to town after working all winter. They come into town and the atmosphere is very somber because a lot of the people around there have been robbed of their cattle, cattle rustling. And they're just hanging out in this town for a little bit, realizing there's not much there, when this guy comes to the saloon and tells everyone in the town that Larry Kincaid has been killed and that they need to go and find justice. They wrestle up a big mob to go out and get them, although they call it a posse because the deputy sheriff is involved and deputizes everyone even though he doesn't have the authority. They go out and they try to find the people responsible. They find 3 people, but those people are saying they didn't do it, and they're not sure if they should hang them because they have Larry Kincaid's cattle, and it's very plausible that they could have done it, but they also say they bought the cattle from Larry Kincaid and no one's really sure what happened, and they have to decide if they're going to hang these men or not. Now, Wellman has always kind of had a pessimistic attitude, and through watching most of Wellman's filmography, I don't think he has the greatest view of humanity, and none more somberly and savagely than this film. Now, granted, I think you can probably figure out that it doesn't turn out so well. The first time I saw it, I was just taken aback at how somber and slow and quiet it is. Most Westerns have action in it, and I guess you could loosely say, sure, this is a Western because it takes place in the West. But a majority of the film is them waiting and discussing whether they should hang these men and the morals behind it. And the people that are gung-ho for it look uglier and uglier to me as the film goes on. Many people say it's one of the best anti-mob mentality films or anti-lynching films. I haven't seen any other anti-mob mentality films or anti-lynching films, but I saw this maybe mid-2000s, and I always thought of things like the aftermath of 9/11 and how people will just all rally behind something, whether or not it's true or not. I guess that's the side of people I've never understood and never liked, especially when you're in a group and that group will decide something and it's like this kind of groupthink mentality. Now, sometimes and oftentimes I think groups can do a lot of good, but when it goes bad, it can get really ugly and disgusting and stupid as well. Wellman had that pessimistic attitude. Now, he put this out in 1943. It was actually made in 41 and sat on the shelf for 2 years because it was World War II. And talking against this kind of mentality wasn't good. People didn't like that sort of thing. They were against Hitler. They were rallying against Hitler. Now, that was good because I don't think Hitler was good at all, or the Nazis or anything like that. But to question that kind of mentality at that time, one critic said, I can't think of a film that has less commercial prospects. And in 1943, I think that was really true. World War II was still going on. Even the producer who let Wellman do this, David O. Selznick, had him do actually propaganda so he could make this film, and made Henry Fonda make some films so he could make this film. And it was a real struggle to make it at the time. This is a film that it's so broad and universal in how it's talking about mob mentality and lynching. When I saw it, thought of it as something reminded me of how people acted after 9/11. I think if I had grown up during, the Red Scare and McCarthyism, I would say that about this film as well. It's very universal and it works very much in that way. The thing about assignment directors and old studio directors is they occasionally wanted to make certain things. They were like the directors now, you get to pick their projects, and this was a project he really loved. Another producer at Paramount had it, but he bought the rights and added $500 onto that so he could get it. Him and Henry Fonda really wanted to make this film, and it's interesting to note that Henry Fonda made a film that's similar, not as dark, with 12 Angry Men in 1957. Henry Fonda wasn't a producer on this, but I guess if there was an executive producer kind of credit at the time, he might have gotten that because he did really help this film get made. I've looked at comedies from Wellman that have the pessimistic attitude that this film has, and they kind of skirt it under the table. They can accomplish something else, like Nothing Sacred, like Roxy Hart. They're both fun movies. They're both funny movies. They're silly movies. You can laugh and not really think about the theory and the thoughts that are going behind it. But the Oxbow incident is making you deal with it, making you deal with the fact that maybe mob mentality isn't a great thing and maybe a lot of horrible things have happened because of it. And like, look at the horrible thing that happened because these people were so sure they wanted justice, but they didn't care who was going to be harmed because of it. They just wanted justice. They needed to be vindicated, and that's all that mattered. Clearly, actual justice didn't matter. They just needed to feel better. Confronting an audience with that, especially, you know, this was the post-code. If you look at films at the time, it was a lot harder to be subversive. And although critics like this film, it actually got a Best Picture nomination. It's one of the very few films to get only a Best Picture nomination. Most of the time when you get a Best Picture nomination, you get other nominations. This only got Best Picture, unfortunately. I think it's lucky to get it. Casablanca beat it, but it is Casablanca, so. It's a dark movie, and I think this and Purchase Price are two films by Wellman that remind me of things that 90s independent directors would do. It shows the power of Wellman and the power of him as a director and how smart he really was and how good of a director he was, that he could put forth such a project like this and really believe in a project like this and feel like, no, this film should get made and I'm going to use the studio system. He had such a relationship with Selznick that Selznick let this get done and let this happen because he was high up on the studio chain. Selznick was, at least. Wellman had a lot of hits, so they were going to let Wellman do this sort of thing. And that's the kind of relationship directors had with the studio at the time. And because Wellman used that relationship, he got a film like The Oxbow Incident made. This isn't a long film, it's only 75 minutes. It's a very simple film. They basically do it, most of the film is on one set. Henry Fonda's character, who's top billed, he's really not the typical leading man. He doesn't get the girl. His girl is married to somebody else. He doesn't really stop anything. He just objects to things. He's almost like not your typical lead. It's very anti-regular structure. It's just very simple and stripped down. Wellman is that he was a very economical in terms of his shots and storytelling. And this film is very simple. It's easy to understand, but there's a lot of complexity in it. And Wellman knew how to do that sort of a film. And in America, it didn't do well. When it did well in Europe, when it eventually got released over there, I think after the war, or maybe during the war, I'm not exactly sure, then it got re-released in America and it made some money, but it was never like a huge hit. And it was just coming off of, you know, he'd done A Star is Born a couple of years before, and Nothing Sacred, and he had had some success. But Oxbow Incident has always been more of a critical film than a commercial film. And I think because it's so dark, and it's not a good example of the period, certainly, but it is a good example of the kind of things I think Wellman wanted to do as a director and the leeway they would give him, because he did deliver. He was a fine director, and Selznick, even though the studio brass were against this, was like, let Wellman do what he wanted. And I'm glad they let him do what he wanted, because when I still watch this film, like, the ending just hits me in the gut. It just makes me feel awful about humanity and makes me feel the way I think Wellman does about his pessimistic view of the world, making these people look savage and horrible and making this idea of lynching someone look as ugly as it really does, especially a director that was as dark as he was. And, you know, he does have some of his hallmarks. He has Henry Fonda and Harry Morgan, you know, they're two buddies, that very brotherly relationship that Wellman likes to have in all his films. It is a great Western in terms of how it breaks from genre and really talks about consequences of death and the consequences of mob mentality. And this film is a lot about consequences and a lot about... One of the things I've always liked about Wellman is Hollywood was very Republican in the studio days. It's just a fact. Like, there are very few liberals. I think Henry Fonda was. I don't even know, to be honest, actually. But Wellman never really subscribed to any belief. You know, he was always kind of an outsider. He always kind of believed in what he wanted to believe in. And this shows that more than anything. I've always looked at this as one of his more important works because of what it says about humanity. And I think it's something that we will continue, unfortunately, to see about humanity, because people are pack animals and they like to move with people, whether it's right or wrong, and they don't like to think about what that group is doing. They just think people like to be a part of something. And there's certain dire consequences to that. This was one of those films, when I saw it, I didn't really know what I was seeing. I didn't know what I was getting into. It's the kind of film that just shocked me. And I think it's, it is a film that you could say that Hollywood at the time owed a lot more to theater, a lot more to the theater than it certainly does now. I like its pessimistic attitude, but I also like what it says about humanity and how truthful it is. I always hear about older Hollywood, how, it's putting on, that's not reality, but this film feels very real to me. It's amazing that Wellman made so many different films, but I never saw him make a film. I mean, I haven't seen everything yet, but I can't imagine he could ever make a film as powerful as this. Reminds me a lot more of his pre-code period than this, and it's definitely one of my favorite films I've seen from him in the 40s. Wellman took that extreme because he was Wild Bill Wellman, and he did what he wanted, and he wanted to make the Oxbow Incident. And every time I see this, I'm kind of stunned that someone could make a film just this powerful and this simple. I think that speaks a lot to Wellman, that he could make a film that's powerful and simple and so politically charged at the time they had to throw it on the shelf for 2 years. They weren't sure what to do with it. He was a different kind of guy. He was very rebellious, and not because he drank too much for a little bit, or he partied too much, or he had, all of that. He really artistically was wild as well. No film shows that better than the Oxbow Incident. It's definitely one of my favorite Wellman films. It's one of the Wellman films you have to check out. And it's just a really just amazing piece of cinema. And I think it shows you what you can say about humanity in film as an art form. And no film has done it as simply, as savagely, and as pessimistically as the Oxbow Incident. So if you have seen the Oxbow Incident and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. So the next film in my William Wellman series will be The Story of G.I. Joe, and that will be next week, probably Wednesday or Thursday. And thank you for watching, and I hope to see you then.